Husband secretly advised a coworker on fixing his gay son, and now I'm preparing to leave this marriage. I want to preface this by saying that I honestly don't know how my husband behaves at work. He works an office job, while I work as a receptionist at a daycare, and we recently bought our first home together. Everything I've learned about this situation came out of the blue when I received an email from a woman named Louise, the wife of one of my husband's coworkers. She included actual screenshots of conversations between my husband and her husband, Edward, about their son. Louise and Edward recently had their son come out to them. According to Louise, she's been supportive, but Edward has only pretended to be. Instead, Edward has been confiding in my husband at work, expressing his discomfort and looking for advice on how to handle the situation. What completely blindsided me was realizing that my husband agreed with Edward and has been trying to comfort him, offering advice on how to fix his son, all while knowing Louise has been nothing but supportive towards her child. The messages Louise sent me were stomach-turning. They showed my husband and Edward openly discussing strategies, such as talking to the boy one-on-one without his mom present, and making plans to meet outside of work to keep the conversation going. They even considered getting dinner together to discuss it privately, away from their wives. In one message, my husband said that if it were his son, he'd set him straight, and that he'd take away privileges, even sports, until he changed his mind. He also criticized Louise for being so open with her son, as if that was part of the problem. I never knew my husband felt this way. I called Louise as soon as I got her email, apologizing and trying to support her however I could, even though I don't really know her. She feels incredibly hurt and lied to, not just by her husband, but by mine as well, for encouraging this toxic thinking. My heart broke for her son, too. We talked for a long time. She hasn't confronted her husband yet, and she's considering having one of her parents with her. When she does, she doesn't even feel safe doing it alone. I told Louise how disgusted I was with my own husband. We don't have children yet, and frankly, I don't want to have kids with someone who thinks or talks like this. I'm still trying to process all of this. My anger at my husband is impossible to describe. I don't want to be with him anymore, and divorce is at the very top of my mind. But for now, as much as I want to scream at him or kick him out, I haven't confronted him. Louise isn't sure yet how she wants to proceed, and I refuse to do anything that increases her risk or that of her son. This isn't only about my feelings, it's about her family's safety and well-being. I promised Louise I'd wait, as hard as that is, and support her in whatever way she needs. Right now, I just want advice on the best way to move forward with the information Louise gave me and how I can support her and her son. My own plans are up in the air. I know I'm done with my husband emotionally and likely for good, but all of that can wait until Louise and her son are as safe as possible. It's excruciating to have to sit with all of this, but I can't put my need to confront him above their needs and safety. All I want is to do what's right. When I finally sat down with him and showed him the emails Louise had sent, he didn't bother to deny a single thing in her messages. Instead, he told me I was wrong for going to her first. He tried to flip it, said he never went through my things and that I should have talked to him before anyone else. He insisted that we come first, and that what I'd done couldn't be excused. But how could I ignore what I'd read? How could I reconcile the man who supported our hypothetical children being whoever they needed to be, with the things he'd said at work? I pressed him for an answer, and he deflected, said maybe I wasn't the woman he thought he married when I was at work, told me I was controlling for questioning his actions, and then declared he didn't know if he could trust me either. He wanted space. I asked him directly, point blank, about what he said and what he really thought about Louise and her son. That's when the truth spilled out. He called Louise stupid for supporting her son, griped about how overblown gender topics it had are, and dismissed her son's identity, saying the boy only did it because it was popular and would probably regret it one day. The disgust and dismissal in his words floored me. When he said he wanted space, he told me he'd be staying with his brother for a while. I'd already been considering going to my parents, and now I had no reason not to. He left for his brothers, and I moved in with my parents, who immediately surrounded me with support. They listened as I poured all my second-guessing and heartbreak out in the evenings. My dad pointed out how my husband tried to twist everything around and blame me that the true version of the man I married came out only when I wasn't looking. My mom said what I was trying not to admit: my husband lacked the character I thought he had. When the shock faded, I knew I wanted a divorce. I can't imagine having children with someone I no longer trust, but I can't pretend I'm not afraid of what comes next. What if I never get married again? What if people look down on me or friends turn away when they find out? Meanwhile, my husband has started ranting on social media, painting me as unfaithful, spinning lies to get ahead of the story and control the narrative before the truth comes out. Thankfully, my parents are already helping me line up a lawyer. But the swirl of emotions and doubts is harder to handle. I keep asking myself, how do I cope with the fear of being alone or rejected by people who don't know the whole truth? How do I quiet the doubts that haunt me late at night, telling me I'll never trust anyone, or myself, again? Update 2. A couple of months ago, my world shifted in ways I never could have anticipated. I had written about my now ex-husband giving advice to a coworker on how to make their gay son straight, advice he gave behind his wife's back. Since then, I've divorced him, but even now, the weight of everything that happened continues to crush me. I hesitated to share more, but I realized that sometimes, some stories need to be heard, and I can't go on in silence. At the time, what I originally knew barely scratched the surface. There was so much more happening beneath it all. Let me start from the beginning, before everything unraveled completely. My ex-husband worked an office job, and we never had children together. Out of nowhere, I received an email from Louise, the wife of one of his coworkers. That one message flipped my life upside down. Louise included in her email screenshots of unsettling messages between my husband and her husband, Edward, about her son, Jake, just 14, who had recently come out as gay. Louise had Jake's back, but Edward pretended to be supportive at home while, in reality, he ranted to my husband at work. But Edward didn't just unload his frustrations, he actively conspired on how to fix Jake. And my husband didn't just passively listen. He offered advice so cruel it broke me. He said that, if Jake were his son, he would punish him by pulling him out of sports, force him into girls' sports, and isolate him from friends until he got his act together. That wasn't even the worst of it. They talked about Louise herself, how Edward was disappointed in her support for Jake, and my husband suggested they go out to dinner to discuss Louise and fix Jake behind her back. They even talked about taking Jake on drives or a father/son weekend to work on him. The words they used to describe Jake were so vile I can barely recount them. After reading those messages, I was nauseated, but I waited to confront my husband. Louise was vulnerable and didn't have much support. Edward had made sure of that. When I called Louise, she confided that her parents didn't know what was happening yet, so I held off confronting my husband to avoid him tipping off Edward before she was ready. Those few days felt like an eternity, but I had to protect Louise and Jake from whatever additional harm an early confrontation could cause. Eventually, with her parents involved and a plan in place, I confronted my husband. The confrontation was as ugly as I feared. I laid everything out: the emails, the messages, the fact that he'd once told me he'd love our hypothetical children no matter who they were. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he focused on how I was wrong to talk to Louise first instead of him saying we come first. He insisted that work was his personal space and resented my snooping. He told me I was probably not the woman he married when I'm at work. That line hurt me more than I've felt in years. He said Louise was stupid for supporting Jake and that gender issues and LGBTQ topics were overblown. He said Jake probably did it for attention and will regret it one day. That night, he said he'd stay at his brother's. I told him I'd stay with my parents. He didn't fight me, and for me, that was the moment I knew I wanted a divorce. He would later agree the marriage was over. But there's more, and it hurts to write. What I didn't realize at first was that Edward had already started acting out his twisted version of a fix, taking Jake out for father/son time alone and telling Jake not to mention any of it to Louise. She only discovered it after coming across their messages, weeks after he had begun. Louise tried everything to piece together what happened. She talked to Jake herself, brought in a therapist, worked with various pride resources and support organizations. But Jake struggled to share those details, even in therapy, and Louise was left with more questions than answers. And then Jake was gone. He took his own life while Louise and Edward were still getting divorced. I eventually met Louise and Jake in person. Louise's parents stood by her through the storm, helping her navigate the divorce. Edward was furious when he learned Louise had reached out to me, but she stood her ground with her parents' support. Louise agonized over telling Jake about the divorce, a burden that ate at her. Jake's death shattered all of us. Louise blames herself every single day. Nothing soothes the ache. She still doesn't know what happened between Jake and Edward during those times alone. Not she, nor the therapist, nor anyone else can say for sure. But Louise is pursuing an investigation with the help of her parents and a lawyer. As for me, I don't think I'll ever truly forgive myself for being married to a man who helped set these tragedies in motion. I often feel sickened by my own association, weighed down to the point that I can barely function some days. I've needed prescriptions just to make it through. But it's even worse for Louise and her family, a pain deeper than I can imagine. I asked Louise if there was any way I could help remember Jake. She told me she wants Jake's story to be a rallying cry for others to keep fighting so that what happened to him never happens to another child, no matter their gender or orientation. That's why I decided to share this, not because it's uplifting, but because it's necessary. Louise is determined to ensure this tragedy isn't repeated. She plans to get involved in her community, not just in LGBTQ+ advocacy but in groups that help children at large. She doesn't know when, she's still healing, but she will if fire's been lit. As for anyone who hears this, I won't tell you what to feel or what to do. Conviction comes from within. I just want to share how Louise is trying to carry on, and she knows I'm sharing this. If you take anything from this, let it be a reminder, what we say and do matters. There are people who need to know they are not alone. Update 3. I didn't think there was anything left to break. After Jake's vigil, the world went quiet in that way grief makes everything muffled. Then Louise called me one Thursday night, late enough that my first thought was something awful had happened again. It wasn't that, not exactly. Her voice was steadier than I expected when she told me an investigator from the state attorney general's office had reached out. They'd gotten wind of a youth counseling ministry that had been quietly running sessions out of a church basement 2 towns over no licenses, no oversight, a cash box and a clipboard, and Jake's name was on a Hendrickson intake sheet. I couldn't get my breath for a second. She read it to me over the phone, the way someone reads a spell they hope will undo itself if they say it slow, first name, last initial, a parent signature that didn't look like hers. The date was a weekend she remembered Jake coming home wiped out and quiet, the same weekend Edward had insisted on their father-son time. The intake sheet had a second line, referred by, and beside it, in block letters I recognized from 100 sticky notes on my own fridge, my ex-husband's name. Everything after that became movement. Louise's attorney subpoenaed records, the AG's office followed up, the church denied knowing anything about it, then produced a rent agreement for their basement signed by Men of Resolve Fellowship, which, according to a sun-bleached Facebook page, was building resilient boys into men. It looked like a bake sale had crashed into a boot camp flyer. The faces in their photos were shattered under the gym lights. I kept looking for Jake in those pictures, like if I found him I could reach in and pull him out. I didn't think I had anything else to give, but a process server came to my parents' house anyway. He handed me a manila envelope that felt heavier than paper should. My name on a subpoena, and the name I changed back to after the divorce. They wanted any backups, any messages, any digital crumbs that could prove where the recommendation came from, how the connection was made. My stomach dropped remembering the old iPad in a box from the move, the one my ex had used on the couch at night, watching game highlights with one eye and texting with the other. It was still signed into his iCloud. I turned it on and watched the battery icon crawl from red into life. The home screen was a photo I'd taken of us at a fall festival, pumpkins and cider and us smiling in a way that felt like theft now. The Messages app had a little red bubble I didn't touch for a full minute. When I finally did, the thread with Edward was right there. It wasn't only the work chat. It was everything. Him sending a flyer for Men of Resolve, circled in blue with "worth a try," written in the message below. Edward asking if they went hard on discipline and my ex replying that the coach is old school but effective. There was a Venmo request too, a skull emoji in the note like this was a joke. Another message had an address I'd never seen, and when I clicked it the map opened to the back entrance of a church with a locked metal door. The dates lined up. The first session. The second. A weekend retreat set out at a camp with a lake, where the men in their photos posed in matching shirts and the boys kept their eyes on the ground. I took screenshots of everything, every blue and gray bubble, my hands shaking so badly some images blurred. The last thing I expected was a video. Edward had sent a clip from inside the church basement, maybe to prove to my ex he was actually there. It was only 15 seconds and it was mostly cinderblock wall and the edge of a folding chair, but you could hear a man's voice in the room calling what they were doing corrections, and you could hear a boy cry out that he wanted to go home. The video ended with someone laughing in a way that didn't have any humor in it at all. When I handed the iPad to Louise's attorney, she treated it like I was passing her a newborn, careful, reverent, knowing it was both precious and breakable. Chain of custody. Hashing the files. All these words I'd only ever heard on TV, suddenly happening at a wooden conference table that had a ring from someone's coffee mug on it. My ex got fired the next week. HR had been conducting a review since that anonymous complaint landed in their ethics inbox months ago. The screenshots Louise first sent me started a clock I didn't even know existed. When they asked for his work emails, they got more than they bargained for. He'd used his company account to coordinate with Edward on everything from quiet dinners to keeping her out of it, and there was an email to a Gmail address registered to Men of Resolve asking for their parental consent form and if their methods were faith-based or results-based. He didn't tell me they let him go, his brother's girlfriend did, when she texted me to say he was packing boxes with that stunned, angry face men get when the world doesn't hand them a script to read from. He tried to call me later that night. I let it go to voicemail. He said he wanted to clear the air, that he was cooperating, that this wasn't how any of it was supposed to go. He didn't say I'm sorry to anyone who needed to hear it. Edward lawyered up. The church posted a statement full of words like saddened and misunderstood, and Men of Resolve scrubbed their website. It didn't matter, screenshots already existed, and the registration to rent the basement did too. The AG's office opened a consumer protection case for fraudulent services and unauthorized counseling of minors. The county initiated its own investigation into potential abuse. The closest I've ever come to relief since Jake died was hearing someone with authority call what happened to him by a name that wasn't parenting or values. Louise asked me to come over one afternoon to help her sort through boxes Jake's teachers had returned to her. The school had gathered the contents of his locker, his gym bag, the little things you don't think of until someone hands them to you in a plastic bin. We sat on her living room floor and made clumsy piles. In the bottom of one box was a spiral notebook, the kind with the wire that always catches on everything. Jake had put stickers on the cover, a skateboard brand, a cartoon fox, a rainbow lightning bolt he must have picked up somewhere. The first pages were math problems. In the middle, there were song lyrics he'd copied down, pages of them, lines he'd circled and underlined so hard the paper almost tore. In the back, there were doodles of a lake with little waves drawn one after another, and a figure standing on the shore. I don't know why seeing that lake turned both our stomachs. Neither of us said it out loud. We just didn't. Word got around town in the way it always does. One of my old classmates works at the paper and asked if Louise would speak on the record. She thought about it for a few days. The decision cost her something, I could see that, but she said yes, and the piece they ran held on to his name the whole way through. They didn't flatten him into a cause. They wrote about the way he teased his grandpa for always falling asleep during movies, the time he stayed late to help a friend with a science project, how he could flick a bottle cap into a cup from across a room like it was nothing. They wrote about what that basement was, too, and which laws say you can't do that to a kid in our state. The morning the paper came out, someone tied rainbow ribbons to the fence outside the church, one on every link for as far as the eye could see. By afternoon, parents and kids were standing there quietly, holding each other. No shouting. Just presence. The ribbons stay up until the rain took them. The day the ACT office served Men of Resolve with a civil complaint, a different envelope landed in my mailbox. My ex's lawyer wanted me to sign a non-disclosure as part of resolving lingering property issues. It would have barred me from speaking about anything related to the events that led to our divorce. I took it straight to my attorney. She laughed in that furious, disbelieving way that has no joy in it and said we would not be signing anything. I wrote back once, in ink on actual paper, because some things feel better that way. I told him the only thing I owe him now is my silence in the room when we pass each other in a grocery store aisle. A week later, Louise's attorney called to tell us a man had come forward. He was young, a volunteer at the church who had helped set up chairs in the basement and ferry bottled water back and forth. He had left after watching what the coach called breakthroughs, left because he couldn't sleep. He handed over a thumb drive with recordings he'd made on his phone, shaky audio from corners of the room where no one was looking at him. The coach barked orders, you could hear the slap of something against a table, you could hear that same voice from the 15-second video call what he was doing building a spine. Once, in the background, clear as anything, you could hear a boy say, please stop. He didn't record Jake, the dates weren't right. But you could hear what the place was, and that was enough to turn the AG's investigation into something with teeth. I don't know what accountability looks like when the thing that matters most can't be returned. I only know that the first hearing is set for next month. I'm going to give a statement under oath about what I found on the iPad, what he said, what they planned. Louise will speak about the signature that wasn't hers on a form that should never have existed. Edward will sit somewhere with his lawyers and listen. My ex will be there too, because he's on the witness list now, his name printed alongside a number that matches the line on the intake sheet, referred by. I wish I could say that any of this feels like victory. It doesn't. It feels like walking through a house after a fire with a clipboard, counting what's left standing. Some nights, I can't hear Jake's mom humming in the kitchen because she forgot the song as words. Some afternoons, I catch my own reflection and don't recognize the woman looking back until I remember that I made it out of a life that had rotted through in ways I didn't see. I've started going to a support group on Wednesdays. We sit in a circle and there's nothing dramatic about it at all. The fluorescent lights buzz, the coffee is bad, and people tell the truth in small pieces. It feels like rinsing a wound, awful and necessary and cleaner after. On the anniversary of the day Jake told his mom the truth about himself, the neighborhood kids drew chalk rainbows up and down the sidewalk. I stood with Louise on her front steps and watched the colors bloom under the summer sun, all those little hands smudged blue and pink and yellow. One of the kids kept running back to the same spot, pressing the chalk into the pavement so hard it snapped and then using the stump anyway. I keep thinking about that, the way he wouldn't stop just because something broke in his hand. The line was going to get finished. He decided that and then he did it. There's a lot left to happen. There will be depositions and hearings and all the cold machinery of consequence. There will be mornings where we forget 4 or 5 minutes and then remember. But beneath it all, something else is growing too. Louise met with a counselor who specializes in helping parents navigate schools and systems for their queer kids, and they're putting together a resource guide for our district. A teacher at Jake's school started a scholarship in his name for a kid who wants to go into social work. The first donation came folded into an envelope with a sheet of notebook paper inside. In uneven handwriting, someone had written, "He helped me with my math. I want to help someone too. I don't know if justice exists the way people talk about it. I do know the truth does, and it's stubborn. It shows up in basements and inboxes and ink on paper, in red tape pulled off church doors, in chalk ground into concrete by a kid who refuses to stop coloring. That has to count for something. It counts for me. It counts for Louise. Most of all, I hope it counts for Jake." Update 4. They set the first hearing for a Tuesday, which felt wrong in the way grief makes you superstitious about days. Louise and I got there early anyway. The courthouse with already awake bailiffs leaning on doorframes, a woman at the metal detector dropping a set of keys that sounded like a handful of coins hitting a jar. We sat outside the courtroom with paper cups of water that tasted like dust, and I tried not to look at the frosted glass, as if the shape of whoever walked past would tell me what would happen. Inside, it was all oak and microphones that picked up the sound of someone's sleeve. Men of Resolve had 2 lawyers and a man at their table I later learned was the coach, though that word wilted as soon as I saw him. He had the kind of tan you get from a lifetime under fluorescent gym lights instead of the sun, and a tie that didn't know how to behave. Edward sat behind them, a row back, his jaw jerking the way it did when he was chewing gum he shouldn't have had. My ex came in late and chose the end of a bench, eyes on the floor where the varnish had worn off to pale spots. The judge asked the state to go first. The assistant ag was a small woman with hair pulled back so tight it made you realize how soft the rest of the room was. She talked in a way that made you lean forward without meaning to, about unlicensed services marketed to parents and what our laws say you cannot do to children no matter how devout your marketing materials are. When she played the audio the volunteer had recorded, the room changed temperature. It wasn't cinematic. The sound quality was bad. You could hear the scrape of a chair against concrete and a man pacing, and then that voice saying corrections, like you'd say nap time to a toddler, and a kid's breath hitching in a way that made me want to climb the benches and pull the wires out of the speakers. They called Louise. She wore a simple blue dress with sleeves because the courtroom AC freezes you from the wrists down, and she kept her hands folded in her lap when they handed her the consent form with the wrong signature. The ag had brought in a document examiner who looked like he belonged to a different decade, all suspenders and a tie that flared at the bottom, and he stood at a wheeled easel and talked about hesitation marks and line quality the way gardeners talk about blight. The thing that stayed with me wasn't the science though. It was how Louise tilted her head when he showed the projection of her real signature next to the one on the Men of Resolve form, and how, even from 10 feet back, you could see the difference. Hers moved like it knew where it was going. The other one stopped and started like it kept changing its mind. When they put me under oath, the court reporter's machine chuckled under her fingers. I told the truth in the flat sentences they asked for. I told them about the email that sent the first crack down the middle of my life and the iPad that was never mine and always was because it lived on our couch, glowing through 100 weeknights. I told them about the red bubble on the messages icon and the way my hands wouldn't behave when I opened it, and how my ex's texts to Edward weren't theory, weren't values, weren't anything but logistics and timestamps and skull emojis under Venmo requests like you could make this into a joke if you just pushed hard enough. Men of Resolve's lawyer tried to get clever. He asked me whether accessing the iPad wasn't tantamount to hacking. He asked me whether I understood the concept of marital communications privilege, as if there was a cloak you could throw over the hurt to make it disappear. He held up a printed screenshot of the blue and gray message bubbles and said the word spousal betrayal without blinking. The judge raised 2 fingers, like he was calling a timeout none of us deserved, and said the privilege didn't apply to communications made in furtherance of a possible crime against a child, and reminded counsel that evidence obtained from a device still logged into a shared household account is not the Fourth Amendment war they wanted to fight that day. Men of Resolve's lawyer sat down a little too quickly, like his knee had given out. The video Edward had sent my ex from the basement played next. It was 15 seconds long, but if I closed my eyes, I could map the cinderblock pattern by heart. Someone in the wooden gallery behind me muttered a curse under their breath that had nothing to do with God. When the assistant ag paused it on the last frame just an edge of a folding chair, a hand, the ugly slick of Jim Flower under fluorescent light you could have heard the paper cup sweating onto the table. The judge issued a temporary restraining order that afternoon. It was the plainest way to say stop, which is what I wanted the law to say from the start. Stop. Stop meeting in basements. Stop calling it faith when you mean force. Stop making a business model out of a boy's body. The order shut down Men of Resolve, froze the sliver of bank accounts and cash boxes they could find, and told the church to hand over whatever records they had under lock and bad lighting. The pastor didn't look at anyone when he left, just straight ahead like a man practicing for a perp walk he hoped he'd never have to take. Deposition started 2 weeks later because that's how fast these things happen when a judge's patience has already been used up. They put my ex in a room with glass walls and a table that showed every fingerprint, and they handed him a stack of exhibits with his own words on them. He tried to play the same hand. He was just trying to help a colleague. He didn't know what happened in the basement. He couldn't control how other people used the information he shared, and then the assistant ag slid across a printed email from his work account to the Gmail address on the Men of Resolve flyer, the one that had asked for a parental consent form and whether their methods were faith-based or results-based. There's a particular sound a man makes when how he sees himself cracks. It isn't loud. It's like someone stepped on a dry twig in the woods and the bird you were watching flew off before you got to really see it. He gave names after that. Not in the way you think, all drama and shouting. Just in the weary way people do when the story they've been telling about themselves collapses and there's nothing left to do but catalog. Other dads who'd asked for tips. A coworker who'd said, "My nephew's getting confused at school, where'd you take that kid your buddy was worried about?" A cousin on his brother's girlfriend's side who wanted something that worked. Half of them won't amount to anything but a note in a file. But a few lit up places the investigators hadn't gotten to yet: a youth retreat in the next county run by a man with a different name and the same face, a Facebook group where they traded strategies like recipes, an out-of-state wilderness week with intake forms that required only a first name and a cash deposit. Around the same time, the county finally filed criminal charges. Not all the words you want, not all the ones you say in your kitchen when no one is listening, but words with weight, endangering the welfare of a child. Unauthorized practice of a regulated profession. Battery, in one instance, because another kid's mom decided she had enough of the shame they count on and walked into the sheriff's office with photos and her son shaking, furious voice and just didn't stop talking until someone took notes. The ag added consumer fraud claims with all the quiet relish of a person who knows that while you can make a church argue with you about morality until you die standing up, you can make a business hand you its bank statements before lunch. Edward broke in a way I didn't expect. Not to apologize, he hasn't done that, and I don't know if he ever will, but in the way men do when the paperwork starts stacking up. He tried to file an emergency motion to seal certain records to protect his privacy. The judge handed it back with the judicial equivalent of a shrug. He tried to get Jake's name scrubbed from filings. The AG's office had already redacted what needed to be redacted to protect a minor's dignity. The first time Louise and I saw him after that, it was outside the clerk's office by the vending machines. He stood there with a soda, staring at the spiral in the carbonation like it had a script for him. He didn't look up when we walked past. For once, we didn't either. The church asked the pastor to step down pending an internal review. A deacon with a talent for public speaking read a letter one Sunday about misalignments with our values. After, a man in a suit no one had ever seen before counted the offering and took the little box with a padlock. In the middle of all of it, someone sent Louise a scan of a youth group newsletter from 5 years ago with a coach and a grainy photo at a picnic table, captioned with his old name. A search of public records showed a closed investigation in another state, dismissed on a technicality when a witness moved and didn't appear. The dates on that showed up beside the year he relocated here and started Men of Resolve, with a checking account opened at a credit union that had a poster in the lobby about small business loans and free coffee. I had to go back to the house I used to share with my ex because the court wanted the original iPad, not just the compass. It felt like walking into a rental of my old life. The walls were the same color they were the day we moved in, which felt mean. He was there when I got there. He'd been told to leave for a window of time and didn't. He had that lost look men get when they've been sleeping on couches and telling themselves it's just temporary. He tried to talk to me in the driveway, like we were normal people who had weathered something minor. He told me the ag had offered him a cooperation agreement if he was fully forthcoming. He said it like an act of generosity, like someone had offered him a seat on a lifeboat he would kindly pull me into if I just admitted that I'd been too hard on him. He asked me to say the iPad had been compromised, that maybe my dad had helped me get into it, anything to muddy it enough to be useful. He kept using "we like it belonged to us." There are words I want to put in my own mouth here, cutting and righteous. The truth is I just said no. Not whispered. Not shouted. Just no. He said I would regret making this adversarial. I wanted to laugh and couldn't. He moved out of my way like a man who had just remembered where he was. I walked the iPad to my car and put it in the backseat like it was sleeping. The paper ran another story. This time they printed photos, not of the man in polo shirts with their hands on kids' shoulders like trophies, but of the church basement door standing open with evidence tape like a red ribbon snagged on the handle, and of the lake at the camp just after dawn, fog hanging in a way that made the tree line look like a smudged drawing. They included a note at the end about the scholarship in Jake's name. A guidance counselor sent Louise a photo of the first recipient, a kid with the serious eyes of someone who has already decided who he is in a way that scares adults. The note he'd written when he applied was clipped to it. I want to work where I can make sure no one is alone. At the school board meeting, a mom stood up and named conversion therapy like it was a rattlesnake coiled under a porch. You don't argue with its placement, you get it out. She asked what language the district had on the books and what they would add now. A teacher I know from the daycare showed up with a stack of resource guides Louise and the counselor had put together, printed and stapled and smelling like warm paper. They disappeared in minutes. No grandstanding. Just hands taking what was needed, and feet walking out to use them. The hearing on the permanent injunction is set for early fall. Between now and then there will be more of everything that makes you want to leave your own body. Discovery deadlines, affidavits, the long phrase cruelty uses to wrap itself in something that looks like procedure. There will be a criminal arraignment where the coach will say not guilty because that's how this works, and a bond hearing where someone will talk about ties to the community like the rented basement of a church and a P.O. box count as belonging. There are rumors that churches ensure her is quietly negotiating, which is the ugliest kind of validation, the kind that arrives with a dollar amount and an admission that they didn't want to make but had to. On the day they served the permanent complaint to Men of Resolve, I found a single ribbon caught high in the fence outside the church, one of the rainbow ones that had somehow made it through wind and storm. It snapped when I tried to untie it, and I stood there with two short ends in my hands like I had broken something new. A teenager on a bike stopped and handed me another ribbon from his backpack without saying anything. He looped it through the chain link and tied it with that neat, quick motion only people who have practiced know. Sometimes the only thing you can do is do a thing again, better. Louise took me to the lake. We went early, before the camp counselors were awake and the day had chosen mood. The water was so still it reflected the trees until we threw pebbles on the surface and made little earthquakes for the sky. She stood with her hands in her pockets and didn't say much. When she did, it was about ground she'd walked with Jake once, a trail that was nothing special except that it was theirs. On the way back to the car, we passed a bulletin board with a sun-faded map and a missing cat notice tacked under a plastic sheet. Someone had stuck a post-it on it that said found, with a wobbly smiley face. It felt almost offensive to see something ended cleanly. But it also felt like a reminder that some loops do close, even if not the ones you need most. I'm not pretending this is a story with a moral. The best I can do is tell you the shape of the days as they happen. Today looked like sworn statements and a judge who did not blink and a man whose name was printed on a line that should never have existed, being read aloud in a register that made his shoulders fold. It looked like a counselor picking up the phone and a kid choosing rainbow chalk over white. It looked like Louise buying a binder to hold copies of everything and then refusing to call it a binder because it sounded too much like school. She calls it the book of what we know. The night before I wrote this, the power flickered at my parents' house during a storm and went out for real. We lit candles and sat listening to the drum of water on the roof. In the quiet, my mom started to hum, and a few seconds later found the words. It was the first time in a long while I'd heard a whole song in one piece. I don't know if justice will give us that a whole piece. I do know the truth keeps showing up, ungainly and stubborn, flipping on lights in rooms you didn't even realize were dark. And when it does, we write it down. We add it to the book of what we know. We carry it into courtrooms that smell like old pencils and ask men in robes to make it mean something. And when we step outside again, into whatever sky's waiting, we tie another ribbon on the fence and keep going.